And Fry, you've got that brain thing.
I already did.
I don't think Fry is human. Humanoid, certainly. Human, though? Well, that depends. Is Jesus from the Bible a human?
Buckle your sphincters!
This video is gonna get weird. Up front, no disrespect to religious folks. This is in no way an allegorical comparison. This is a categorical one. I'm not talking about some sort of Joseph Campbell monomyth BS where all main characters represent Jesus because the hero's journey involves a metaphorical death and rebirth either. No, what I'm asking is, if Jesus was in like a D&D monster manual, what would he be classified as? My first instinct was to just call him a demigod, given his half-divine, half-mortal heritage, but he's not listed in Wikipedia's list of demigods, so there's more going on than that. And besides, Hercules might be the son of Zeus and a mortal woman, but both individuals are independent corporeal entities. Unlike Zeus, the Judeo-Christian god isn't a physical entity, certainly not in the same way. God appears to people in the Bible, sure, but Zeus is like an actual dude who just lives on a really big mountain, if I remember that stuff correctly. This corporeal disparity allows for a unique relationship between father and son that puts Jesus in a different category from other sons with celestial heritage. He's more than just the son of God, he is God too. That is, he's the physical avatar of that non-corporeal entity, inserted into the linear timeline via pregnancy as a savior. Just like Fry. But instead of being the avatar of the Judeo-Christian God, he's time itself instead. Now don't worry, this whole video is about justifying that absolutely out-of-pocket statement. And I swear to Fry, I'm not trying to start a cult here. Okay, so to get to the bottom of what Fry is, we need to talk about when he came from, and why it's different from a lot of time travel stories. To do that, we're going to have to first unpack how Futurama handles time travel in general. Look, time travel, just like any other made-up bullshit, comes in a variety of flavors. The rules for time travel aren't anywhere near universal because time travel isn't real. It might be theoretically possible, or whatever, I don't know, I'm not a scientist. I just watch too much Futurama. But, being a show whose premise literally hinges on time travel, Futurama has a deep relationship with the trope. Quite a few Futurama episodes have time travel in them. All of them are bangers.
Bollocks!
Okay, most of them are bangers. Regardless, using a broad definition of the concept, the following 11 episodes have some form of time travel. There are a variety of time travel tropes and rules throughout these 11 episodes, but they can be divided into two main categories. The Terminator rules, where the timeline doesn't change, and Back to the Future rules, where the timeline does change. Okay, well, I guess there is a third category, and we'll call it traveling forwards in time is still technically time travel, I guess? Okay, but let's put that group 3, to the side for the moment, because there's a huge disparity between the first two categories to address first. Now, I don't think there's a universally correct way to tell a time travel story. As long as the rules serve the narrative and are internally consistent, it's usually fine. The Terminator and Back to the Future have diametrically opposed views of time travel. Neither is more or less correct, and both serve their respective narratives. On an episode-to-episode basis, this is also true for Futurama. But when the series is considered as a whole, there are some glaring inconsistencies. But let's start where the series is most consistent, because a lot of the series follows a template similar to the Terminator. Fry is far from the first fuckboy from the future. Kyle Reese plowed the way forward for Fry when he went back in time and planted the seed of the revolution. The main thrust here is that in the Terminator, the timeline is linear and rigid, and I swear that last one was actually unintentional. The point is, time is fixed, and any change made to the past isn't a change at all. It's always happened that way. Kyle Reese is always in that motel room, making love and, I guess, war at the same time. This is, for the most part, how we see Futurama approach time travel. Most famously, of course, is Roswell That Ends Well. There are some key differences between Kyle Reese and Fry that we'll get into, but from a time travel structure standpoint, the stories follow similar rules. The Roswell incident in 1947 wasn't aliens. It was, and always has been, the Planet Express crew. Enos, was always killed in that nuclear blast, and Fry has always been his own grandfather. Nothing changes when they go back in time, just like a robot can't go back in time and kill John Connor because he's already alive in the future. We see the same set of time travel tropes appear in the latest season on Hulu. I Know What You Did Last Xmas uses Fry's name as shorthand for trying to go back to the past to change something, only to make it happen.
Oh, I've made a complete fry of myself.
Santa is evil, and has been evil since this moment, because the professor went back in time and made him evil in that moment. Farnsworth has always been there in that moment, setting Santabot's naughty nice sensor to naughty. And he always will be there setting that switch, just like Fry has, and always will be in 1947, giving his grandma Mildred a cream pie. Some of the linear timeline rules in the other episodes aren't as clear, but they're present. Hell, Decision 3012 is just reverse Terminator. Instead of Skynet sending a robot back to try to crush a human resistance before it can even start, the last remnants of humans send Chris Travers back in time to stop the robot uprising in the first place. But the outcome is the same. By sending Arnie back to kill Sarah Connor, the robots accidentally kick off the very resistance they were trying to prevent. And when Senator Travers runs against Nixon, he inadvertently assures Nixon's victory and the subsequent takeover of the robots.
You see, since Nixon wasn't elected, the robot uprising didn't happen, and Travers never got sent back from the future.
The humans of 3027 sealed their own fate when they sent Chris Travers back to challenge Nixon in the 3012 election. In doing so, he handed Nixon victory before a single vote was cast. People will remember Nixon running unopposed in the election going forward, but the truth is, he was always running against Travers. But a President Travers didn't exist, so he can't exist.
I don't give a bag of butts who won the election. Nothing's gonna change.
The would-be president-elect, Chris Travers, is promptly deleted from the universe by the paradox-correcting timecode. He was so wildly out of alignment that he just straight up disappears. Unlike the other paradoxes we see get corrected in Bender's Big Score, which honestly look more like mob hits than anything else.
With all due respect, Dombot, I don't think we should rely on an accident happening. Let's kill him ourselves.
Speaking of which, the first Futurama movie has quite a bit of time travel in it, and plotting it all out would be a video by itself that honestly probably already exists somewhere else on YouTube. But for our purposes, I want to look at the general rules of the time travel in the movie because they support this overarching deterministic structure I've been outlining so far. We see one of the clearest demonstrations of this phenomenon when Bender appears in the middle of the movie to put the universal timecode on Fry's ass.
I'm Bender from way at the end.
Sure enough, at the end of the movie, we see Bender take the timecode off of Lars's ass to do just that. This isn't just limited to the internal timeline of the movie. It's revealed that the destruction of New York City by UFOs that we see in the first episode was actually caused by Bender when he was looting throughout time. Despite the fact that Bender is stealing nearly every object of value over the course of human history, his burglarizing doesn't appear to actually alter any of that history. Nothing changes when he returns, and the item still has value, so it still exists in history. Hundreds of Benders have always been stealing artifacts and just chilling with them in a cave where Planet Express will eventually be built. Nothing is changing except our perspective. When one Bender tells all of the other Benders to wait, and something actually does change, the universe tears a hole in itself, correcting what otherwise would have been that change.
Well, we're boned.
To this point, we've discussed pretty clear examples of this consistent timeline. From here on out, there are definitely other ways to interpret some of these methods of time travel. The rest of these episodes might not fully support this linear idea from all perspectives, but they, at the very least, don't contradict this interpretation of an inalterable timeline. What I'm saying is, if we're picking a lens to view Futurama's time travel through when discussing Fry's origin, Roswell That Ends Well will be that lens. With that in mind, I want to talk about Category 3 before we talk about Category 2. Let's clear the first two out of the way. There are time travel elements in Space Pilot 3000 and Mobius Dick that aren't really relevant to this conversation, and neither support or disprove this unified time travel theory that we're building. They're on this list though because they are technically time travel.
Technically correct.
The best kind of correct.
But that's not the only reason they're on this list. The first episode is very significant to Fry's origin story, despite being the most rudimentary form of time travel. Rudimentary. Not realistic. Cryonics are a scam, kids, don't believe it. Or, I guess maybe adults? I don't think kids know who the fuck Ted Williams is. Anyway, as for Moby Dick, while the crew doesn't exactly time travel, there is a fair amount of time dilation throughout the episode, which again...
The best kind of correct.
This also shows us that the universe does apparently have fourth dimensional beings, which is going to come up later. The whale moves through time in a way that is entirely foreign to us, but could support this idea of a fixed timeline. If we consider the timeline like the surface of the ocean, the whale can essentially breach and dive into different spaces on the timeline. As with your standard issue whale breaching in the actual ocean, they can come up wherever they damn well please. Mobius is basically swimming around under our perspective of time, ready to breach through at any moment. Literally, any moment. That's definitely time travel. But there's nothing in the episode to suggest that the whale is making changes to the timeline by breaching and diving in and out of it. The first Planet Express crew didn't disappear from the present because the whale ate them in the past. They disappeared in the past because they were eaten in the past. The whale can move in and out of the timeline at will, but it seems to be subject of the rules of the universe when it's inside it. Like I said, the time travel itself in both of these episodes isn't super relevant, but some of the lore is.
It's a 4-dimensional space whale!
It'll come back up. Rounding out this group, we have our two examples of forwards-only time travel. This method feels simpler than the time travel we've been discussing because, hell, I'm moving forwards in time all the time. To be fair, these examples are significant changes in speed, and I'm always moving through time at the same pace. Well, almost always, at least.
Where's the device that lets you speed or slow the passage of time?
Under the seat.
Time dilation, or not, moving through time, even forwards through time, at a substantial clip higher than we typically do.
Don't make me tap the sign.
Now, fast forwarding through time seems pretty basic on its face, but an interesting view of a wider universe begins to take form when you look a little deeper. In Time Keeps On Slippin', for example, we find out this.
It's as if we all behave normally during the time skips, but then we have no memory of it.
You mean we just...
My, yes! Ooh, just like that.
This could indicate that while there may appear to be moment-to-moment free will, there's actually some sort of autopilot for the universe. This speeding through predetermined time is most obvious in late Philip J. Fry, where time is seemingly so linear that you can go right past the heat death of the universe through the Big Bang back to the origin point, not just once, but twice. However, the use of the forwards-only time machine clearly has some ability to impact the outcome of the future. We see a potential future where Leela runs Planet Express that happens only because of the absence of the Professor, Fry, and Bender. And this isn't just a narrative trick either, showing us something that didn't exist, because Leela takes actions in the past that Fry sees in the future. But as soon as Fry, Bender, and the Professor return to the same spot where they left after those few laps around the universe, that future would be gone. Our time travel rules suggest that they would have always done that, making that future impossible from the get-go. As I mentioned before, there are other perspectives to view some of these time travel episodes through, some of them better than the one that supports this fixed timeline theory. This is one of those episodes. Having something more like alternate timelines makes more sense for the self-contained plot of this episode. And while I think that's the proper way to view this one, for the sake of this argument, here's another way to look at it. The timeline that includes Leela running Planet Express is a paradox, like Senator Travers or the hundreds of Benders, and it needs to be corrected. We don't see the universe fix every aspect of this paradox, but we do see it fix some.
Pow! We took care of the time travel paradox.
Regardless, I think there is some evidence of the linearity in that final scene that I just referenced.
This new universe is about 10 feet lower than our old one.
Let's consider for a moment the movement of the forwards-only time machine. This is something that is very easy to put on a timeline because the machine's movement is by definition in a single dimension. That is not the first dimension, but moves strictly through the fourth dimension and in no other way. It doesn't even move in space, it just moves in time. It's in the same physical spot through time. Because of the way we perceive time, when it's moving, we can't perceive the machine, but it's always sitting there in that spot. Not only that, because the three of them looped around the universe, it's literally always sitting in that spot. Further still, because they looped around again, there's always two forwards-only time machines hurtling through time in that spot. Theoretically, the second is physically offset from the first, because the first was always in the way and the second was always right next to it. Look, like I said, time travel is silly. You'd go crazy trying to line up all the rules of all the time travel episodes in Futurama, because unfortunately, they are inconsistent. We're going to get to some of the more inconsistent episodes in a moment, but I want to stick with the forwards only, later I guess just general time machine for the moment. Because I think for the most part, when they're trying to build the lore of the show in particular, they're trying to stick to this concept of you can't change the past. Before we go any further, spoilers for the latest and the last season of Disenchantment. If you aren't familiar with Disenchantment, it's a 5-season Netflix animated series from Matt Groening that was produced in part by David X. Cohen. It also takes place in the future of the Futurama universe. In the final episode of the first season, Dreamland Falls, the character Lucy uses a crystal ball to essentially rewind and play back time like a video. Not actual time travel, just time viewing. As the crystal ball's gaze passes through time, it catches a glimpse of Fry, Bender, and the Professor passing through in the forwards-only time machine. It's a fun little Easter egg for an enormous crossover audience, but it also establishes a possible link between the shows. Was it possible that the medieval New York we see while Fry is frozen is actually Dreamland? It was entirely possible, based on the evidence that we had at the time, that Fry was just somewhere in Dreamland, literally chilling in the cryogenics lab. But he wasn't. When Futurama returned on Hulu, Professor Farnsworth used the spruced up machine to run a full lap, again, but this time in reverse. Instead of seeing the time machine from Disenchantment's perspective, this time we see Bean, Elfo, and Lucy from Futurama's perspective. Shit's peer-reviewed now. These universes aren't just linked, they're the same. In fact, I can tell you that Disenchantment takes place sometime before year 10,000, which is the first stop Fry and the gang make in the forwards-only time machine. In the year 10,000, Fry discovers a series of statues of liberty chronicling the rise and falls of various civilizations. Apparently, every future species also has an America and France, too, I guess. Anyway, in I Know What You Did Last Xmas, we see this faint image moments before we see the gang from Disenchantment just kind of hanging out. This happens while the professor is moving in reverse, implying that it happens sometime between the year 3000 and the year 10,000. My guess is somewhere around 6500 CE. Okay, that's more like a fun fact that it is relevant to the point I'm making. Tangent aside, the fact that these shows are linked and specifically linked via time travel is actually important, because this latest season of Disenchantment had some full-blown time travel of its own, and wouldn't you know it, it operates on the same fixed timeline rule set. Episode 5, Season 5, Who Shot Elfo, tries to set up a twist that any longtime Futurama viewer would likely see from a mile away. When Elfo picks up a crystal ball to go back in time to kill the person who killed him, equipped with a bow and quiver for what felt like the first time ever in the 5-season series, I couldn't help but say out loud, well, obviously he's about to shoot himself. And sure enough, moments later,
Who did that?
I did that.
my overall disappointment with Disenchantment's finale isn't what I'm focused on here though. The point is, this is evidence that time travel in Disenchantment also works on a fixed linear timeline that cannot be changed. By extension, it's further evidence that the Futurama timeline, which we've established is the same timeline, works on the same rule set. But, as I mentioned earlier, not all Futurama seems to operate on the same set of time travel rules. Which brings us to our third category, Category 2, which, okay, I know I'm kind of out of sequence here, but we're talking about time travel. It's on theme, roll with it. Anyway, let's start with Meanwhile, because I think this one kind of sits on the fence. On the surface, Fry and Bender are clearly making changes to the timeline when they're stealing diamonds from this dude to make an engagement ring for Layla. When they take a diamond and hit the button, that diamond stays in Bender's chest. And there's one fewer piece of coal in that dude's coal case 10 seconds later. Or earlier. Earlier? Earlier. Later. Because let's think of this more abstractly, through the lens established by Roswell that ends well. If we think of the timeline as a rope, when somebody hits the button, something they will have always done, there's a knot on the rope. If they hit the button every 10 seconds for a while, there might be a big knot in the rope, but still, when you tie a knot in a rope, it's still a line. It's not straight, but it is a line. This is an oversimplification, of course. There's probably some sort of quantum tunneling thing going on rather than a knot. I'm not a time travel scientist. I don't think that's a thing. The point is, if Fry going back in time and killing a dude doesn't change history, then Fry taking diamonds 10 seconds to the past doesn't change history either. Fry always takes those diamonds and always hits the button in that moment, just like Roswell, just like Robot Santa's first Xmas. Like I said, this is one interpretation. Probably not the first one you'd go with, but it works within our established rules. The Why of the Fry and all the president's heads, on the other hand, operate more like Back to the Future. When Marty goes back to 1955, he has to be super careful not to screw up the timeline. His meddling in the past directly impacts the future to the point where he almost completely disappears from existence. And some of the changes he sets in motion never go back to their original state. He prevents Doc Brown's death. The name of the mall changes. His entire family is much better off than they were before he time traveled. And I guess he gave Chuck Berry the idea for Johnny Be Good.
Chuck, it's Marvin! Your cousin, Marvin Berry!
Wait, hold on. Well, that doesn't quite line up, does it? Marty is changing the future when he's knocking over pine trees and knocking out bullies, but when he plays a song that already exists in his timeline, it inspires the song to be written? What if he didn't play Johnny Be Good at that moment? Would Chuck Berry not write the song 3 years later? Hold on, is giving Marty McFly credit for Johnny Be Good kind of low-key racist? I'm not the person to answer that question, nor is this about Back to the Future. My point about this movie is that the timeline is malleable. The future can change as a result of actions taken by somebody from the future in the past. In Futurama, we see this concept most explicitly in all the president's heads. I really don't care for this episode that much, but we do have to talk about it because it does have time travel in it, even though it's the dumbest form of time travel in the whole series. For starters, opal is just a mineraloid, which means it's like a mineral, but it's just not a crystal or some shit. There's literally nothing special about this blue rock.
They're minerals.
Mineraloids, actually, Hank. The names they throw around throughout the episode, opal essence, crystalline opal, these are just different physical states of the same stupid rock, all to make a sweaty reference to the Andamuka opal given to Queen Elizabeth II. Something I had to look up, and I hate that it's something that I now know. Dumb rock aside, the time travel in this episode strays far from Futurama's typical approach. The crew makes repeated changes to the future. Some minor things, like preventing the American Revolution whole cloth, but some really big things as well.
I'm Andy Warhol, and you're some kind of marvelous lobster man.
This is some Marty McFly-ass time travel. I don't really have an elegant way to fit it into the rule set we've been building. Hell, I don't even have an inelegant way to cram it in. So, what's going on here? I want to try to answer that question before we talk about our last time travel episode, The Why of the Fry, because I think it's going to help frame the way we look at that situation and, by extension, Fry. Let's take another look at the episodes we've looked at so far. Instead of categorizing them by the rules, this time we're going to group them by the method of time travel. And we'll make some pretty broad strokes here so we can group them. As I mentioned, while technically time travel, Mobius Dick and Time Keeps on Slipping are more time dilation than outright time travel. For our purposes here, they don't create scenarios that would allow for alterations to be made to the time stream, so we're not going to worry about them. The rest of the episodes divide into 3 methods of time travel: a variety of time machines, the universal time code, and that fucking opal. So let's try simplifying it a bit more. What if we called the time machines artificial and the other methods organic, for lack of a better term? Artificial time travel is clearly constrained to the rules established earlier in the video. If you make a machine and go back to the past, basically anything you do is something you've already done in the past. You can't change anything. Organic time travel, on the other hand, may be governed by other rules that might allow for alterations to the timeline, like the opal. Because, not to tap the sign again, but technically, the universal time code does allow for alterations. It just corrects them. Consider the end of Bender's big score. Newdar has been sending virus-controlled Bender after virus-controlled Bender back to the past to wait under Planet Express until it's time for that specific Bender to return. But when virus-free Bender goes back and invites them all
To stick around instead of coming up when they were logically supposed to.
he's made a drastic alteration to the timeline here. It's ultimately corrected, but there was a brief moment where things were out of alignment. We see the same thing happen when Senator Travers is briefly President-elect Travers, before he's just gone. This is very different from Roswell That Ends Well, where what happens is just exactly what happened. But there's one small problem.
And it's a big one.
The late Philip J. Fry also has a paradox that is eventually corrected. As I mentioned earlier, we see this potential future that ultimately doesn't exist, where Leela runs Planet Express after Farnsworth, Fry, and Bender disappear to the future. Now here's where I'm going out on a limb again. It's possible that this future we see was more than just influenced by the birthday card that Fry drops. What if dropping the card was the very reason the alternate future existed in the first place? This sounds a bit crazy, but it's definitely not the craziest thing I've said in this video about Fry being a Jesus. Did you remember that's what this video is about? That was probably like 20 fucking minutes ago. I hope you did, because I'm about to get to that. Put a pin in the whole birthday card birthing a future thing for a moment, because it's time to talk about the why of the Fry. Obviously, we need to talk about the time travel we see in this episode, but first I want to frame the time travel we don't see. And I'm not talking about Nckbrker. He didn't time travel.
My people lack that ability.
No, I'm talking about the fact that the entire plot of this episode is built around the fact that Fry is his own grandfather. Fry is able to withstand the brain's attack. This is because he lacks the delta brainwave, and this is because
I did do the nasty in the pasty.
we're probably going to refer back to the scene later, but for now my point is, in order for the plot of this episode to work or even exist, the timeline has to be fixed, like most of the episodes we've looked at. Unfortunately, that seems to contradict what we actually see happen in this episode. After using a quantum interphase bomb to send the infosphere and the brains into an alternate universe, Fry utilizes the infosphere to return to
the nexus point between universes, at the space-time where you entered the cryogenic tube. You, and only you, can return there.
But when Fry arrives at that nexus point, it's not somewhere he's supposed to be. He's out of step with the timeline. We've seen this scene before, and Fry's silhouette wasn't in the pilot. His presence in that moment is already a change. A simple explanation would be an alternate branching timeline, but that's not how Roswell That Ends Well worked, and this episode doesn't work without Roswell. So how is Fry making changes to the timeline? Because his presence in that moment isn't the only change happening.
Just remember that Scooty Puff Jr. sucks!
There's a reason Fry disappears in that moment. He wasn't vanishing until he started to say the word
Sucks!
That's because this is the exact moment that the timeline is actually altered. Nckbrker now knows that Scooty Puff Jr. isn't gonna cut it, and when the time comes, he'll opt for the Doombringer. He's making changes to the future. Not oops, it turns out I had always made Robot Sentinel evil false changes. Impactful alterations, like what we're seeing throughout all the president's heads. Which wraps up the time travel portion of what we're talking about here. By returning to a nexus point in space-time only he could return to, Fry managed to upgrade his Scooty Puff Jr., which suggests that this was an organic form of time travel. Fry moves through time differently. This could also explain why losing a birthday card could cause a paradox. He has a disproportionate influence on time. Fry appears to be some sort of fourth dimensional being, not constrained to our perspective on time, similar to Mobius Dick. But, unlike the whale, who just moves through time differently, Fry seems to be able to make alterations. There's something more to him. Like I said, it comes from when Fry came from, and it's time to now look at how it's different from other time traveler stories. As a comparison, I want to look at John Connor. As I mentioned earlier, there are some similarities in the Terminator and Futurama's view of time travel, so looking at a son of a time traveler is an appropriate place to start. Conceptually, the situations are comparable, except for one glaring disparity. The Terminator has a whole other fucking dude involved. Kyle Reese came from the future, sure, but he was also born in the distant future of 2004. Fuck. Terminator is an old movie. He had parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. I mean, he lived during the robot apocalypse, so they probably weren't alive anymore, but they had existed. John Connor's lineage is warped, but it's still lineage. Half of it is just traveling back in time at some point. If we look at Fry's timeline in the same way, we see something very different. Just like Sarah Connor, Grandma Mildred's lineage goes back throughout time, but unlike Kyle Reese, Fry's loop is just that, it's a loop. Fry has a father, that's clear, but his lineage doesn't go any further back on that side. Fry's lineage is Fry, Yancey, Fry. It's not a line, that's a loop. He's not related to Enos at all. Neither is Yancey. Yancey isn't even related to all of the Yanceys he lists off for his son Yancey when he's trying to get him to accept his name Yancey.
All the way back to Minuteman Yancey Fry, who blasted commies in the American Revolution.
The John Connor comparison, it just doesn't work here. And that's because we're looking at the wrong would-be savior of humanity with the initials JC. We're looking for the OG JC. Jesus has an origin story that might align a little bit better. Now, I'm not saying the details are anywhere near the same. For one, Futurama's was hardly an immaculate conception.
Oh my God!
And also the whole grandfather factor. Again, I'm not saying Fry is Jesus, just that he's a type of Jesus. I really should have established a better term up top. Avatar is already a theological term, like demigod. In fact, it seems like there's actually a whole debate about whether or not Jesus is or isn't an avatar based on the Hindu definition of the term, and I have zero skin in that theological game. For me to be able to speak to that debate properly, I'd have to do a lot of research on Hindu theology that I'll admit I'm not prepared to do. Also, I'm already on like page 13 of this video about Fry, and diving into the history of Hinduism feels like a whole thing, because I'm not just gonna sit here and regurgitate a Wikipedia page for you. But ultimately, I'm not talking about theology here, I'm mostly talking about semantics. The fact that there's a debate around whether or not Jesus is an avatar or an incarnation makes me hesitant to use avatar as a term. I guess I could use incarnation though, right? Wait, it's just fucking God man? The term for what Jesus is it's just God man? I'm not saying that's not accurate, but just my God, man, the lack of creativity. Okay, I'm sorry. Let me get back on the timeline. My point here is this. If we look at John Connor's lineage timeline, both sides of his parentage can be traced back throughout history properly. Fry and Jesus, on the other hand, only have a maternal lineage that can be traced back throughout history. Fry's path from the future is similar to Kyle Reese, but his actions terminate the assumed paternal lineage, creating a new one from nothing, like when God cucked the absolute shit out of Joseph. Though I guess to be fair, Fry killed Enos, so at least God let Joseph live. To be fair, I don't think that this alone is enough to call Fry a God man, but for time. A time man, if you will. His unique relationship with time travel could just be a plot hole. And accidentally knocking up your grandma is hardly the same as inserting yourself into the timeline as a divine entity. As the story goes, God became Jesus with an explicit purpose, to save humanity. He didn't knock up Mary on a one-night stand by accident. But Fry did have agency in his own creation, and this isn't just the ravings of an unhinged madman starting a Futurama cult on YouTube. In The Why of the Fry, we're told that Fry lacks the Delta brainwave because he did the nasty and the pasty. But that's not the only time the Nickelodeons pontificate on Fry's brainwave. There's a line in The Day the Earth Stood Stupid that is the key to all of this. This isn't about the why of the Fry at all, it's about the how of the Fry.
Somehow, he has cobbled together a random assortment of other brainwaves into a working mind.
Like a prom dress made from carpet remnants.
He cobbled together his brainwaves like Leela built a prom dress? There is so much agency implied in that statement. That's gonna take some doing, and Nibbler confirms the accuracy of her analogy.
Yes, like your prom dress.
Now, if Fry is a time man, we're never going to establish the exact moment he created himself, because it's going to escape our grasp of space-time. There is, of course, the obvious moment of creation in Roswell, but the scope is larger than that. Here we see Fry entering this plane from another dimension, literally breathing himself, and by extension the rest of time and space, into existence to save the universe from the giant brains.
Say what? Dude's crazy!
Okay, that's fair, but it's not based on nothing. The Anthologies of Interest episodes show non-canon events that happen within the what-if machine. So using them as evidence isn't concrete, but hear me out, because according to the professor,
it can answer any what-if question accurate to within 1/10 of a plausibility unit.
As I've said a few times, there are definitely other ways to look at all of these things. It isn't definitive, I'm just saying if you have a little faith, it's plausible. Look, when Fry destroys the cryotube instead of entering it, it rips a hole in time-space so large the universe just seems to disappear. A simple time paradox wouldn't cause this. We've seen paradoxes corrected. We've seen paradoxes corrected so drastically it tears a hole in the universe, but this is a completely different level. In fact, in the same vignette, we do see a small tear in space-time, but that happens when they're just trying to beat Fry to death. I get it. It's the what-if machine, but they're trying to kill Fry and it's literally opening a rift in time. Do you see what I'm getting at here? Fry is time, and time is Fry. Why else would the universal time code be tattooed on his ass?
It was bound to be somewhere.
I've admitted throughout this video that a lot of this evidence is kind of circumstantial, but let me tell you why I believe it. Jesus the God-Man walked on water, then turned that shit into wine, and made a blind man watch him do it. You know, miracles. Sure, Fry defeated the brains twice, but that just proves he doesn't have a delta brainwave. Not that he's a God-Man, time man. He acted as a cross-universe ambassador to Evo and helped defeat the Dark Ones, and while I could try to stretch those events into miracles, we aren't just looking for any old miracle. There's time at play here. Does this prove my theory? Probably not. Honestly, I don't think this is something that can be definitively proven. But this is the scene that made me believe. And if I haven't convinced you yet, well, that's alright. Philip J. Fry is here for you regardless. Because time made a fool for all of us. Anyway, thanks for watching. Bye.